Elaine, welcome. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing today, Deborah?
I'm doing really well. I'm doing really well. I trust that you, as the author of the only book on the history of female drug traffickers in Mexico, you must have been speaking to a lot of people about the impending launch of Griselda, the Netflix series recently.
I'm speaking to some, yes.
So let's, the series is very much about her sort of time in Miami, and she's credited largely with one of the main players bringing cocaine to the US, and especially the city of Miami. But can you tell us a bit about her origins? Like, when she was born in 1940s Colombia, what were the conditions in which she was born into?
So Griselda was born into, a time of intense violence within the country and political and social destabilization. But that violence, created a tremendous amount of destabilization, leading to many people fleeing the country, but also to acute violence. And scholars have documented profound violence that Colombians observed and were victim to, including the use of rape as a political and a tool of war during this time.
And was that part of Griselda's experience as a child? I understand that, she had a kind of troubled relationship with her mom. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, she was born in Cartagena and then would move to Medellin, and there are different stories about her mother, about, maybe Griselda being the daughter of a wealthy landowner where her mother worked, or that her mother was a sex worker.
And what was her induction into the criminal underworld?
So there's a lot, again, from different scholars and also who have worked on Griselda or have talked to people who knew her, that she came home one day and either her mother's boyfriend or her stepfather attempted to sexually assault her, and she flees. And she doesn't find a sympathetic mother, and so she ends up on the street, where there's again, whether she was also a sex worker, or if she was a pickpocket, or really just kind of a street criminal. But she was very young. She was, a tween. So she was on the streets at a very young age and trying to survive in a time that was tremendously unstable.
How do you think her childhood contributed to her very famous capacity for violence as an organized crime player? Because obviously, we've both written extensively about women in organized crime, and there are women who aren't particularly violent and outsource it or delegate it, but Griselda was famous for not shying away from that whatsoever.
I think, she would have observed it. There are, kind of urban stories that she began to use violence as a tool for control and power very, very early. But she would have definitely witnessed it, not only in her household, but also in the communities around her. And so, for a young person who has experienced trauma over and over again, this would have been a way of which she would have seen powerful people act.
Yeah, I mean, what about the way that we're seeing her portrayed? I haven't seen the series yet. I'm going to be binge watching that this week, but
yeah, me too. Yeah,
I get from the trailer that there is a significant amount of violence, and they have sort of dampened down Vergara's beauty a little bit to make her look kind of, more like the sort of, I think, mid-50s woman Blanco was when she was in Miami. But tell us a little bit about her career in New York, because Miami is kind of the sort of eye catcher and the headline, but she had a career in New York that spanned a lot more years than her time in Miami, right?
Yeah, definitely. She was, she's been documented, been in New York by the mid 1960s, working with her first husband. They were involved in human smuggling, and forging of documents. And so, with Carlos Trujillo, that she was kind of building a real foundation in crime that would serve her for her entire career. And I think one thing, we know she was poorly educated, but she was involved in falsifying documents and forgery, which means she had literacy skills as well as profound intelligence. So by 1964, she is in New York City. She's in her early 20s. She has 3 children before she's 21. And she has already started to build a transnational criminal organization in her early 20s with a perfect partner who would be her, Carlos Trujillo. But she will also encounter other Colombians who have also fled, who are involved in falsifying documents or human smuggling or the early drug trade. And one of them is Alberto Bravo. So all of this is happening in, the early in the mid 1960s, and she's a very young woman. But by the time that she's starting to be surveillanced by the NYPD in 73 and 74, and those members of her organization, she's already phenomenally wealthy.
It's incredible to think that she did that in her 20s with 3 children already.
And no internet or encryption,
right?
Or cell phones,
if you
or
just,
beepers even, right? No beepers.
Yeah. And when you look at today and how, as women, we also kind of, always, we generally bear the burdens, the lion's share of the child caring burden. I can only imagine what it was like for her in the 1960s, like the gumption it must have had to be taking care of that, as well as building a criminal empire that amounted to what it was.
Right. And then not only building it and also investing in it, like taking her resources and investing, kind of creating a criminal research and development wing of her organization, which is really phenomenal. And again, shows a tremendous amount of intelligence and savvy that is rarely discussed.
Yeah. So one of those 3 children, she called Michael Corleone, I understand.
The youngest, her 4th, Michael Corleone. Yes.
Right. And we've seen over the last few days that he and his siblings, I think, are trying to sue Netflix for the use of her image. We've seen that Michael especially has profited enormously from his mother's reputation. What do you think of that?
So, Michael is is her son. I think he's her only surviving son, as I understand that her oldest son has also passed away. And, so he is her heir. If you want to think of that. So I would say if anyone is entitled, any man is entitled to be able to speak about her and provide that insight, it would be him. But it's just so amazing to me, the men who've surrounded her, who worked for her, undermine her. And I'm not talking about Michael Corleone, right? He speaks about her in a very different way than the men who I think who've been interviewed about, who worked in her organization, where she was their boss. And they co-opt her story, but it is hers. She built it long before she got to Miami. She built it in New York.
What do you think she'd make of how she's portrayed from what you've seen?
Griselda was, as I understand from, documents and interviews and things, she was obviously charismatic. She was very attractive, very, she wasn't what you would call, kind of movie star glamorous, but she was a very attractive woman. She was very charismatic. She was very friendly. She was outgoing. And that you can see that in the photos of her, but there's this. And so we have to remember that when she comes to New York, she's in her 20s and she becomes very, very wealthy. And there's beautiful portraits of her as a young woman, a very young, highly stylish, sophisticated businesswoman who is not even 30 yet. And that I think is frequently lost in these conversations about her intelligence, her poise, her charisma, her business acumen in those early stages. And that's lost. And she was in New York longer than she was in Miami.
And how do you balance? Because, when we talk about her, it's hard not to be impressed, honestly. And obviously, we can't forget that she ran a viscerally violent organization. And today, organized crime does I believe, still pose the greatest threat to public security in Latin America. How do you balance that, you know, that respect without kind of glorifying what she did?
You know, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that as a young woman, for her to survive economically, she was going to be most likely working in crime. If she was going to have any type of socioeconomic advancement, that was the only avenue that was open to her. So whether it was being, you know, a sex worker or being involved in, you know, some other type of crime in Colombia, or in this case, in many ways, she chose a safer path, which was being a logistics and distribution guru, essentially, for the Medellin organization. I mean, it was a safer path, but of course, the more successful you become, the more competition you are going to have. And she had competition not only from other organizations, as we well know, but she also had competition internally from men within the organization. And I think that changes her over time. And so, you know, people change over time. But that doesn't take away from who she was and how she built this organization. But she does become more violent. She does outsource the violence fairly early on, and she herself becomes more violent over time. But the competition and the violence surrounding the entire trade escalates as her own violence escalates. So if we're going to talk about Griselda being violent, we also need to talk about the men who were within her organization, who worked up and down the organization, were as violent as she was, if not more.